My name is David Godwin, and I am the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida. We have a great turnout already today. Thanks for taking the time on a Friday afternoon to hop on a webinar and learn with us from George Jensen with Tall Timbers. I'm here today with Christian Fernandez from our Southern Fire Exchange team. We're excited to feature a presentation by George Jensen. George is the Southwest Georgia Prescribed Fire Coordinator with Tall Timbers. And today's presentation actually came about from a specific comment that we received on one of our webinar evaluations. George, somebody specifically asked for you to come and be one of our speakers. So it's taken a little while for us to get this all lined up, but we do actually read those comments that you guys receive, and we made it happen. So thanks, and we're excited, George. Our presenter today is George Jensen. George is originally from Savannah, Georgia, but he grew up in Berlin, Wisconsin. He attended the University of Wisconsin-Stevens Point, where he studied wildland fire science and conservation biology with Dr. Ron Masters, familiar name to many of us. After some time working on a fuels module, a helitack crew, and with the state of Wisconsin, DNR, George attended graduate school at the University of Missouri, Mizzou, working with Ben Knapp in the School of Natural Resources. For his master's research, George studied how resistance, resilience, and transition silviculture treatments impacted fire behavior and effects in longleaf pine ecosystems at the Joseph W. Jones Center at Itchaway in Southwest Georgia. Currently, George works for Tall Timbers as the Southwest Georgia Prescribed Burn Association coordinator, and he's an adjunct professor of ecology at Thomas University in Thomasville, Georgia. So welcome, George. Thanks, everybody, for joining us today. And just one moment as we trade out presentations, get this rolling.
Welcome again. My name is George Jensen. I am the Southwest Georgia PBA coordinator for Tall Timbers. And this photo dictates everything that I do, basically. So it's a great start photo. We are restoring a lot of habitat in Southwest Georgia that doesn't often see fire, and we have to do it a very unique way. So again, George Jensen, it's a great photo of me, so I included it in here. Bachelor of Wildland Fire Science, Master's in Forestry, and looking a lot about longleaf regeneration, resilient silviculture practices. And right off the top, I want to thank John McGuire, Greg Seaman, and Mark Melvin for photo contributions to this. You'll see quite a lot of photos in here that you might not have ever seen before, specifically looking at the history of fire in Southwest Georgia. And to really kick us off, I'm going to do my best Ken Burns or Dan Carlin, depending on where you get your history from, of the southern pine ecosystem. So just to prep us all, here in the pine woods of the American South, fire is not a destroyer. It is a keeper of memory. Every 2 years, a flame rolls through the southern pines, clearing the underbrush, opening the sunlight, revitalizing the land beneath. Grasses rise, wildflowers follow, and in the open woods, the bobwhite finds its home. For generations, these fire-kept forests have shaped the countryside of the South. The land remembers, and in the quiet places beneath the open sky, the story of the southern quail woods is still being written. Sweet. So that's how this presentation is going to go. But I really want you guys to walk away with a couple key points. The first is that fire is part of the culture of the Southeast. The second is that our forests reflect a relationship with fire sourced by both anthropogenic and natural sources. The third is that current prescribed fire culture is carried by the landowner, supported by the state, federal, and other partners. This culture was disrupted, but it has never fully been extinguished, and the lack of fire results in the loss of southern forest types. The other thing I want you to walk away with is that this is really a tale of two soils. One that's seen cultivation and compaction, and one that is not. So on the right, we see tall timbers, and everything in that green picture used to be cotton. On the left, we see a blimp, or a hot air balloon photo from the early 1900s of some longleaf wiregrass outside of Albany. These fuels, the one on the right, natural longleaf wiregrass, the one on the left is old field loblolly pine, look extremely similar, but they burn differently. And we really have to understand the reason why they burn differently, and hopefully you walk away with that today. But they look very similar to the uh, casual observer, but really these are two different stands of trees. But kind of broadening us back out, we see that this entire region of Southwest Georgia has a mean fire return interval of about 2 years. And we've carried this mean fire return interval through much of our recorded history. So we kind of know that this area is burned frequently. And even with this like tale of two soils, we still see that a lot of our plants and species that establish with mechanisms to deal with this fire return interval of about 2 years. So really, southern forests and fuels burn at higher moistures. This is part of their response to this ecosystem. You see our forests burn green quite a bit, but really, we can burn with some pretty severe flexibility on seasonality. Where we lose that more is actually in those stands that have seen that cultivation or what are considered somewhat old field. Our natural stands and our stands with a higher trees per acre, we can burn year round effectively. So to take that really broad range of southern pines and go really, really small with it, we can find that fire and fuels is literally a game of inches across that entire range. These feedbacks create larger and larger feedbacks at larger and larger spatial scales, but it's really dependent on that subset or that sub-meter spatial size to dictate these fires. And so these small sub-meter spatial scale feedbacks create larger and larger spatial scale feedbacks, incorporating fire and other disturbances. And what does that look like on our landscape? And said another way, these fine scale fuel alterations can create outcomes at the stand level. And this is what we look at when we're looking at burning, 60 burn operations in a year. We're looking at fine scale fuel alterations, and each one of those 60 burns that I personally do, I need to know what the fuels look like. Because again, driving by it might look the same, but really there is a lot going on there. So to break it down even further, we can see that in southern forest types, ventilation, sunlight, I have longleaf here as an example because this is a longleaf stand, but southern pine and oaks all play into the fire and fuel feedbacks in the system. It's a nexus that kind of uh, propels itself across these stands, where our open stands have increased ventilation, increased sunlight, allow for more photosynthesis, so more trees and our C4 bunch grasses to establish, as well as some of our southern oak species and our forbs, of course. And our oaks, as you can see in the top right, may avoid fire in the case of live oak or water oak, where their leaves lay relatively flat on top of each other and kind of create a fuel loading that does not like to burn very effectively, except for this year if you've burned them, or more like our turkey oaks or our southern red oaks that have a nice curled leaf and they actually promote fire. So they kind of have a connotation there. But what we'll see most of the time is these surface level frequent fires of moderate to low intensity. We're mitigating our fuel loading. There's only so much gas in the tank in these stands, and so we're getting these relatively low intensity. And now if you ask a prescribed burner what like me, what low intensity or high intensity looks like versus and also high in severity and low severity, I might have a completely different picture in my mind what a high severity fire looks like because I'm looking at high severity directly in the understory. I'm not looking at the entire nexus of overstory tree and understory tree. I'm generally speaking trying to keep all my fires in the low intensity and moderate severity category or lower in order to keep the timber and keep the trees that I want to propel my fire into the future. I've been asked that question a lot, and it's kind of interesting because wildland fire versus prescribed fire conceptualization of severity is very different. Oop, we're playing this beautiful video again. So across that range, across that real close to 2 year fire return interval, we see that a lot of these acres are burned in the sort of breadbasket of prescribed fire of Southwest Georgia and Northwest Florida. Now, again, in Georgia, 93% of land is privately owned. And so when we're looking at Thomas County on an annual basis burning about 10,000 acres, most of that land is completely privately owned. And so that is where I'm saying that the private landowner, a lot of the times, is driving the fire in Southwest Georgia. And partners like myself, as well as the state and federal partners, we're kind of holding that up and supporting these landowners. But that's a sea of green of private land. And so we really need to remember that these properties have been private and have been managed as private for the last couple, 200, 300 years, and that we have to support these people if we want to keep seeing that 100,000 acres a year burning. And we have more than just longleaf wiregrass down here. Even in Southwest Georgia, we have oak hickory, we have longleaf, we have shortleaf pine oak mixed woodlands, we have loblolly pine. We have a variety of timbered stands that all burn differently, and they've shown up for different reasons over the last couple hundred years. And when we look at our different tree species that show up commonly in Southwest Georgia, we usually focus on pines. So we have our longleaf, our loblolly, our shortleaf, and our slash. And I'm specifically talking about more of the northern reaches of slash, not South Florida slash, because that's a subvariety, a little bit different characteristic. But um, I have included in here some of that connotation, but let's really focus on longleaf, loblolly, and shortleaf. So longleaf is the most flammable with the second most needle cast per tree dropped on the ground with resilience to fire just after about a year and incorporates that grass stage that can handle fire. And it may choose to stay in that grass stage for quite some time. Loblolly, which is the one that most people are familiar with, it's our boards and cords tree in the Southwest Georgia, is extreme. It's still flammable, very tolerant, good competition with hardwoods. Resilience to fire is kind of varied, though. I've heard that stipulation of once they get thicker than a Coke can, you can burn them. But I've seen loblolly mortality personally a little bit more common in the younger stages than longleaf. Shortleaf is kind of in my opinion, a nice mix of the two. It's very flammable, has the most needle cast per tree, very good with hardwood competition, and is a resprouter. So, in what we're going to talk about, these post-harrow, post-cotton, post-peanut field conditions where you're having a lot of competition with your hardwoods, something like a shortleaf pine seems like a very good competitor in that system where other pines might not do quite as well. You'll see some gee whiz facts in this presentation, and this is the first one. I really enjoy this one. So, the term pine barren, when we talk about longleaf pine ecosystems, is one that's been used so universally that it's almost lost its original meaning. And this is a great John McGuire quote, so credits to him. In Alabama, the term was used primarily to describe the longleaf pine forest of our two maritime counties of Baldwin and Mobile, and was meant to describe longleaf pine forests from a distance that looked so structurally simple that it was deemed devoid of diversity. I just love that because when you think about it, it's the second or most biodiverse per square meter ecosystem in the world, and you're calling it a barren because it's so homogeneous. I think that's great. And how we got that structure really was both our there's disturbance, our fire, our wind, our beetle, and our drought. And so we got that kind of barren look through all these disturbances so frequently happening in the ecosystem. We also have things like shortleaf pine oak woodlands, and these are kind of everywhere when you really start to look in Southwest Georgia on private lands. It's just a lot of them people thought were kind of trash and they got rid of them, but I still see these pretty regularly right on the Florida Georgia border. They've actually burned quite a few of these this year when the conditions arise. So they do burn quite a bit differently as they do have more of an oak structure to them. But you'll see these in North Georgia, but you also see them in Southwest Georgia. So getting back to our how we're managing our timber and our stands these days, we have these fire adapted plant species of greatest conservation need, and Southwest Georgia lights up like it's so dependent on fire, and our species are so dependent on fire. So we really need to conceptualize that not only are these species responding to fire, but they're also dependent on fire. And I think this is really important to add, and this is from the State Wildlife Management Action Plan. And it just really highlights the importance of fire in these ecosystems. The next most important thing to talk about is how we have, since Herbert Stoddard there on the left, we've had a direct link to fire. And it's really the people that are keeping the culture of prescribed fire alive in Southwest Georgia. So right from Herbert Stoddard, we have somebody like June White. June White is still burning today. June White's mother learned how to burn from Herbert Stoddard, and we burn with June still today. And so we have this direct link from people that were reintroducing fire back in the day into today. And I think that's incredibly important to recognize and appreciate that Southwest Georgia has that, and Northwest Florida has that unique link of from the old guard to the people that are doing it today. This is some of my Prescribed Burn Association members, and as well as Tall Timber staff and Quail Forever staff out burning, and NRCS staff just watching out on the burn that we did at June's a couple of years ago. So again, that longleaf pine historically is one of the most represented ecosystems in the US with 37 million hectares. Love this picture because those are not mature longleaf pine in the background. Those are slash pine, but you get an idea what the stand kind of could look like in the past. Fire and other disturbances were essential for stand composition and structure, and I am going to reiterate this because it's part of the take home that you guys understand with a very open stand structure. It is one of the most diverse ecosystems in the world. Fire and climate propagate open structure with abundant vegetation, and it's resilient to change. It preserves ecological vitality via close relation with those fire feedbacks. And I understand that not all longleaf is the same. There's a lot of nuance. These are just examples to get you thinking. So this whole presentation, I understand there are sections of Southwest Georgia that this does not necessarily apply to. This is my own views from being out on these properties and providing technical assistance to landowners. I get that there are different fire return intervals. It is regional. There are different soil, there are different topography, there are different fuels that will not be included today. This is just a prime in the pump to get you thinking about your own properties and your own management. I really like dendrochronology, so you'll see a lot of the basis of this presentation tied back to actual fire events, and mostly from the 1700s onward, with really a focus on more recent changes from 1800 to the 2000s. In that time, we may only cover 2 generations of trees, because the thing about trees is it takes 200 years to grow a 200-year-old tree. And we might have a tree that's been around for the signing of the Declaration of Independence all the way to the bombing of Pearl Harbor. And so these are really nice, and dendrochronology is really great to conceptualize what has happened in the last couple hundred years, what the trees have responded to that, how the trees have responded to that, and what can we do to improve the environment that they used to see and that they see now. This is just an example. We can see from about 1800 and 1900 some pretty severe fire event years, but really throughout this, from the 1600s to the 2000s, we can see quite a bit of fire that these specific trees have seen along the Red River in Louisiana. Part of that and a lot of that fire was tribal use of fire. And every year I feel like we see more and more evidence of the use of the tribal uses of fire in the Southeast. It cannot be understated that these are 4 bullet points that do not do justice to how much fire was likely put down by Native Americans to attract and drive game, agricultural site prep, pest management, and defense. There are a plethora of other reasons why a fire would have been lit, But these are just some examples that I have included in this presentation. And then some direct correspondence from various explorers, including Sir Francis Drake and William Bartram, talking about the fires that they were seeing when before Europeans had really settled. So to sum up, the roads so far in Southeast Georgia, pre-1700s, kind of looked like this. Ooh, whoops. Doo, doo, doo. Southern pine longleaf had varying densities of fuels managed by larger fires. Fuels were more flammable because they were comprised of more native ground cover, such as wiregrass and other extremely flammable grasses, such as piney woods dropseed, really contiguous fields and with a different moisture regime than we're currently seeing. And so it cannot be understated that the homogeneous nature of these fuels was part of the reason why both lightning and anthropogenic means created very large fires. We also did not have fire breaks. Mostly, we did not have man-made fire breaks. And so the spatial scale of these fires could be quite large. In the 1700s, longleaf forests began to thin out with the arrival of European settlers. A lot of our old homes and building, as well as naval stores, had the market was there. England had cut most of its own forest down, but it's still a great need for lumber and other products from the trees that we had. It's actually pretty hard to get to Southwest Georgia in the 1700s, believe it or not, but where they could start pulling timber from, they did. There was a quote in a book that I read once that forest and woodland fire behavior is a complex result of topography, weather, and fuels. I don't think that's right. I think we need to add forest and woodland fire behavior as a complex result of topography, human impact, and fuels. So we're going to skip ahead and go right to the Civil War because that's everybody's favorite topic once you get past 30 years old. So we're here. And the land in this area was on the cheap. We had these large tracts of land that were being sold out relatively quickly in order to get capital in American currency because a lot of these properties were owned by people that had Southern currency and really needed to get out of debt. And so these larger properties were bought out primarily by well-off East Coasterners and people from outside of the region that were a lot of European descent, and so a lot of these people had settled in New York and Philadelphia, and they loved spending their winters in coal-fired Baltimore with coal skies. Just kidding. They did not want to do that. They wanted to spend their winters down in Southwest Georgia, where the weather is great and the people are nice. And so a lot of these properties were bought, these large tracts of land were bought with the express consent to hunt or own or to get out of, nasty cold-fired East Coast wet winters. And then, while this was happening, trains were invented, this crazy invention. I know we see them sometimes, but pine trees were logged to build railroad tracks, and the railroad was expanded from Southern Pines, North Carolina to Thomasville, Georgia. Railroads were a fantastic ignition source and kept that fire return interval going. It still happens today that trains ignite quite a bit of wildfires, but back in the day, it was even more so. So, with the advent of these plank roads and railroad tracks being built, longleaf pines quickly declined. During this time, loblolly began to replace longleaf. It's also a native to the area, but is more tolerant. So we can kind of see from 1800 to 1850 in Piedmont, DeSoto, and Talbot County, which is by Atlanta, that our mid 1800s fires in some areas kind of decreased, except for Talbot County. They were kept burning. But there needs to be trees in order to capture fire scars, which is a great point. So if all these lands were clear cut, we won't necessarily see what was happening as easily. In the late 1800s, the naval stores market crashed. Timber was still in huge demand, but the timber became way more of the commodity than it's what it produced. And so naval stores generally speaking, are pitch drawn from southern pine trees. So if when the pitch was not needed anymore, the tree became more of the commodity than the pitch that could draw from the tree. Um, the huge property owners got these properties pre-Homestead Act, so they were buying into these properties right after the Civil War, and just had massive amounts of land that they could operate. And they really had four choices come the late 1800s. So they could cut it and put it into farming, which farming practices due to industrialization was getting easier and easier. They could thin it to graze, which would make it a 1 year fire return interval, and they'd put cattle on it. They could just let it go. They owned it. It didn't matter. It could go to fowl, or they could hunt. And primarily they were hunting quail off of these properties. So if they thinned it and grazed it, they used fire to improve forage and attract free-ranging herds to recently burned areas. There's some really interesting studies out of the Midwest and like the Oklahoma area that show, and Texas that show that recently burned areas draw cattle just as much as water does. It's pretty fascinating. But our Stoddard plot 1 that we have at Tall Timbers, our 1 year rough was actually a control put in to mimic what the thinning and grazing did to the stands, which is kind of fascinating. Um, these farm fields that were open from clear cutting or harvesting post the naval stores crash, it's pretty easy to put them into what I consider long farming, which is production forestry, or to put them into farm fields. So a lot of our timber got cut during this time. The thing about grazing is the soil compaction just is not there near as much as it is when you're farming. So at this time, these very old fields that were clear cut, that's right during the advent of real industrialization down here, and we started to see compaction starting this early. Uh, David told me I could add one meme to this presentation, so I added it. Cultivation seems great, but you're losing your A horizon, you're losing that wiregrass, your loblolly is less firm, and you're getting less water due to impacted evapotranspiration rates. So there is quite a bit going on there when you cultivate the land. To be honest, this cultivation is the reason why we have a tale of two soils. We have our considered old field sites, and we have our more remnant stuff that does not have the compaction near as bad. What does that look like? So when you like lose your A horizon, like that just seems crazy, right? Well, uh, Tall Timbers and some other partners actually documented this on a couple different properties nearby in the Red Hills. So here you can see our clay, our red hills with a little bit of topsoil on top. This stand had essentially lost its A horizon post cultivation versus more of our remnant stuff. You can see that quantified sand, it's there and so much more well drained, less nutrient loading right up on the top. So our more well drained dry site C4 grasses do a lot better. Limited compaction. This is what we would love to see everywhere, but it's just simply not what we have. Got to include a Pine quote in here as well, that the axe and the plow were the greatest threat to the American forest. If you would like to read Fire in America and you haven't, here is a PDF to do so. I'll just pause for a second so y'all can scan that. Sweet. So farming really cannot understate the compaction. It's worse today because we have bigger tractors. I know it's this crazy thing, but the more compaction that we add to the soil, really the worse off it can be. This also created large amounts of our erosion problems, especially in the Red Hills, where we just straight up lost the ability to promote some of the species that we needed to. The reason why I like this early 1900s photo is in the background, you can still see that there are piney woods behind this horse and buggy operation, so to speak, and that there were still bastions remaining, and also the compaction, while bad, was not nearly as bad as it is today. So post-farm grazed burn stands went one direction and unburned stands went another. You can go out of your backyard in Leon County or Southwest Georgia, and you can see exactly this example where there's a plethora of unburned stands to the left versus what the right looks like. And again, that was all cotton at one point. It's just one went one way, one went another, and that directional difference was prescribed fire. But it can also not be understated that the hunting tradition on private ownership kept fire on the landscape. So the people that were burning these stands in the 1900s were people that wanted quail or wanted to have cattle. So what does that look like today if they chose that cattle, old grazing land without tilling? These are two examples from Southwest Georgia. On the left, we have a pretty mature longleaf wiregrass stand, and on the right, we actually have another mature wiregrass stand that got hammered by Hurricane Michael and recovered well. And so even though it lost a lot of its one of its driving fuels, needle cast, you still see that the stand is relatively in good shape. Stand on the right's doing great. This is what our old field tilled stands look like. And you can immediately see in both these stands, we have an outlier. And that outlier is we have much more woody competition here. We have a lot more sweet gum. We have a lot more water oak. We have a lot more live oak in these stands. Not to say they're not pretty, but they do look different. And when you're with a trained eye, you can very quickly tell when a steel stand is old field versus when a stand is remnant. This is actually some restoration project we're doing on the right versus some of our tall timbers work on the left. And again, they can look very pretty. It is not to say that it is not worthwhile to manage these. It is extremely worthwhile and necessarily. They just burn different and they are managed differently. This is a really nice photo I took, so I included it. Again, it cannot be understated the beauty old field stands can produce, especially with proper land management. This is also tall timbers. It just cannot be understated. But again, you can start seeing a lot more woody species in the understory versus what you'd see in some of those longleaf wiregrass stands. So what happened post that decision? The late 1800s, early 1900s, really northern forests had essentially been removed. This caused a lot of interesting things to happen, but let's focus on the increased need for timber. In 1909, the peak market of virgin longleaf pine hit, and mostly everything that was left was cut. But you can see this was all hand cut. So our understory species remained the same. The soil compaction was not nearly as bad. All these trees mostly were cut by hand and hauled off by mules. World War I happened, and the most remnant parent trees were used for wooden ships. So that was kind of a lot of the destruction of those millions of hectares of longleaf pine. So really, we maintained our understory fuels and a lot of the great cutover just because a lot of these were hand cut. And so we didn't have nearly the equipment load that we have now, compacting and tearing up the ground cover. And so our current harvest practices impact fuels into the future of stands. This can be seen. We have to do silviculture. We have to do things absolutely 100%, but we do see some impact. And that's why you have to be very careful about who's harvesting your timber and when. In the 1900s, though, the ones that remain, the pine forests are open. The crowns of trees scarcely touch one another. The floor of these open pine forests is covered with a carpet of grasses and other herbs, mostly perennials, which under the mid climate of the zone retains a verdure for the better part of the year. So this is what it looked like pre-cut and then with the removal of merchantable timber. So the second forest happened, poor regeneration crop due to the way pines regenerate. They're gap phase regeneration species, which means that they need those parent trees. They don't super enjoy being clear cut in natural stands. The first stands to really see the impact of the change fuel at a stand level were these stands. And the second thing that happened with this is that loblolly became important for the paper industry in the South, which is a $2 billion industry still today. So again, longleaf are gap phase regeneration species, so they grow in the gaps created when the overstory trees experience mortality. They do not do super well when a complete clear cut happens, but you'll see them in gaps. They pop up. So we had that. We started seeing more loblolly. We're starting to restore some of our old fields are starting to get, more or less a kind of removal of fire almost completely. Some people were still burning in the 1930s, but this was not everybody. This was a lot of the cattle farmers. This was some of the quail properties were burning still. But for most people, this is that same shack that we saw before. You can see in the background, we have completely lost our open wood stands. With the Great Depression happening, a lot of these smaller farms were left to rot, and some of them were bought back up, but a lot of our more tenant size farms were kind of abandoned, and the decisions of those do we let it go fallow? Do we keep it for hunting, or do we put it in ag become more and more apparent with the advent of photography? And then we hit, oh Lord, where are all the quail in the 1930s? So large reductions in quail populations due to these decisions result in the need to find out why. Toppling on this, we also had one of the most successful propaganda campaigns of all time, which was the Dixie Crusaders, really just nailing down new forestry, pulp technology, boards and cords, and really harping on fire is bad and you should feel bad for doing it. And you may think, George, that's not what they said, but that is a direct quote from the U.S. Forest Service in 1940 that the light and sound and odor of burning woods provide excitement for a people who dwell in an environment of low stimulation, who naturally crave excitement. Their explanations that woods kill off snakes, boll weevil, and service other economic ends are something more than mere ignorance. They are a defensive belief of a disadvantaged culture group. I think Gen Z would call that throwing shade. And you can see the results of how well the Dixie Crusaders did in reducing fire in the Southeast. We look over a couple years, and all of a sudden, 1940s, 19 to 1960, fire is almost reduced across its range. So the Dixie Crusaders, along with everything else, were extremely successful in removing fire. This created what we call mesification. This is not a mesification talk, so I'm going to yada, yada, yada over it a little bit. But just know when fires are moved from a fire-dependent ecosystem, such as pine savannas or grasslands, we lose out our effectiveness to burn those stands relatively quickly as fuel loading occurs. Not to say they won't burn, but the way that they burn is much more intense and much more like a wildfire versus what we experience with our prescribed fire. What does that look like? This is a pine stand burned every 2 years. Um, you know, some sap, some shade, some sun, pretty relatively high basal areas for what you might see in Southwest Georgia. But we burn it every 3 years. We start to see way more shade, lack of stems, hardwood stems in the mid-story, still burned. It's still relatively there, most of the puzzle pieces. 5 years, we've kind of lost it. So everything happens a lot faster in the system with fire return intervals, and we really lose out our ability to manage for the species that we want to if we're not burning it every really 2 years, but in some instances, 3 to 5 years. In full mesification, it's incredibly hard to put a fire through the stand and not see mortality. This is a really specialized burn plan and ignition to get it. What does that look like from the air? It's just the shade. It just shades out everything. So we have lost that biodiversity in these stands. So how do we get this back? How do we manage our timber with new forestry, with promoting quail, with trying to get profit for our timber, and understanding that fire has to happen in these systems. If it doesn't, we get this. Well, we utilize things like the Stoddard Neal system. So we do a single tree, small group selection harvest that emulates that natural mortality pattern, incorporates biological legacies, intermediate disturbances, and really, this cannot be stressed enough, continues the use of prescribed fire. So Herbert Stoddard and Leon Neal developed this system of single tree selection where we're going into these stands, we're managing for wildlife benefit, we're managing for the timber benefit, we're getting pretty nice timber out of these stands, and we can manage these large landscapes effectively, still see profit because all these trees are worth, these are our pole, these are our large, our still strong markets in Southwest Georgia. This is not the pulp market trees. These are going to poles. We can continue the use of fire and make all and sort of get what we want out of our timber stands. So through that research, through Oh Lord, Where Are All the Quail, we have developed a management strategy that helps not only produce the habitat that we want to see, but also still keep timbered landscapes burned. So on the south in the green box, you can see a property that was managed by Stoddard Neal from 1959 to 2023. And I'm going to take a little bit of time to do this because I want you to see what happens on the north side when you don't manage with Stoddard Neal. So still looking the same in the green box, but around it you can start to see we've already lost a good bit of our timbered land from 59 to 69 outside of sort of this box. In 1975, we have the advent of you can see some circular fields happening there. And you can see all outside of this property managed by Stoddard Neal, you can see the border has become more and more distinct through time. And finally, in 2023, the only fields that are remaining are the fields that were managed by the Quail property and Stoddard Neal, and everything else is center pivot agriculture. And so the reason why that these timbered stands remained was A, for the quail hunting, and B, because they were managed by Stoddard Neal. So we utilized, both the profit from the quail hunting, the interest in the quail hunting, but also the proper timber management to keep these properties in, timbered stands that are burned and promoting wildlife. And everywhere else you see center pivot agriculture. We were doing great around the 1950s. With the application and ease of center pivot agriculture, we too fell to the wave of more ag and less forest. We lost a remnant longleaf wiregrass 100-acre fields at a time. That's a direct quote from Baker County. But some bastions still remained. We still see that even through all of that, it's not all doom and gloom. There were properties like the Wade track there were units like the Wade track that were still burned pretty regularly, and these still remain. But really, what we're focusing on more and more is our restoration. So restoring sites like this from old field that are, relatively less managed than some of these quail properties, it's a process. It's specialized burn plans. It's getting a lot of burns done over a long time, and that, reintroduction of fire. And then the first fire you do is only setting you up for the next fire. And the next fire you do is only setting you up for the fire after that. But through time, we can knock back some of these competitive hardwoods that are that encroach heavily in our old field sites. So this is an example from Southwest Georgia of a property that was old field loblolly pine. It was burned pretty regularly, and then the fire was taken off. And so as soon as you do that, especially in these old field sites, you get that messification happening extremely fast. This is a great example of that. They have the overstory timber, but they just were not burning it. But through the last about 3 burns, which was 4 years of burning, 3 burns over 4 years, we could see that we have immediately reduced our hardwood competition to the point where we can actually start seeing other bunch grasses and a lot more biodiversity in our understory. So things like this are what I handle now and what I utilize the PBA for. So my prescribed burn association, about 30% of our burns look like this. And we're taking the education that we have that I've, been able to teach them, and they've been able to teach me. And we've utilized it to start restoring some of these properties in Southwest Georgia that have seen, 200 years of, some management, but maybe none at all. And so we really utilize that certification and education as well as the participation to get that implementation to restore some of these acres. We did 74 prescribed fire operations last year in the PBA. We have about 30% of those were stands that had not seen fire in the last 10 years. So I hope that you guys understand that is these landowners are really starting to care about their lands and what they look like, and really starting to utilize that prescribed fire to do a management goal, to get the management that they want to see on their properties. Whether it's old field or remnant, it doesn't matter. It just really needs that fire to help restore the ecosystems that we have, because they can look really nice. So I'll leave you with another look. Again, this was all cotton at one point, and this is what about 60 years of management of an old cotton field can look like, given the proper management, the proper silviculture, and time for the stands to restore themselves. Looks pretty good to me. I don't know about y'all. Sweet. And that, I think, is it.
All right, George. Well, thank you very much. Great presentation. Enjoyed it. Thanks for putting the meme in there. Uh, Once again, if you joined us during the presentation, my name is David Godwin. I'm the director of the Southern Fire Exchange with the University of Florida, and we enjoyed a presentation from George Jensen, who is the Southwest Georgia PBA coordinator with Tall Timbers. So we have time remaining, and if we hit the 1 o'clock, or excuse me, the 2 o'clock mark, I'm not going to kick you off or George off. So if we have some more questions, it's always fun to get through this part. It's my favorite part. If you have questions, please use the Q&A tool in Zoom, and that'll help us to all see those questions and prioritize them as a so we can get through them in order. If you see a question that you would like us to get to, give it a thumbs up, and that'll help us to kind of get to the ones that are the tops. Awesome, George, that was fun. Enjoyed yours. I feel like we just went on a survey, and the start with the Ken Burns video clip in your quote was pretty fun way to kick it off. And I hope you can see all the cool accolades and appreciations that you're getting there in the chat. Thank you, guys. First question that came in already on the Q&A earlier in your talk, Carolyn noticed your plantation maps slide. And so do you have any information? Are those available to folks who would be interested in one?
Yeah, so those are a John Kohler of Kohler and Associates product. He makes those maps. Those are his maps, and the QR code I have in the presentation should bring you to his page. He had let me use those maps for this presentation, but they are his product.
Very good. All right, another question that just came in from Wes. Wes says, from your experience, how can we help promote public opinion on the benefits of prescribed fires?
Yeah, so this is a fascinating question, and Wes, and honestly, it's really all about what your neighbor thinks. I think that's what a lot of the findings come, and I'm not a researcher in social science, but from my experience and talking to some of the researchers in social science, I think the best findings that they have is it's really surprising that overall acceptance comes from keeping up with the Joneses, so to speak. My PBA president, Tom Reed, has a great quote where he says, he burns to burn his property for habitat, but really what keeps him up at night is he feels a need to burn his property because all of his neighbors burn. And so he feels like he would be the odd man out if he didn't burn. And so there's like almost a social implication to do that. And I think that that's really that where we can promote public opinion. And so establishing a bastion, a demonstration area and working from there, getting a local champion of prescribed fire and building out from there is great. And also it's just showing people the 3 years post burn what a unit can look like. I think that's what the Albany bush pine reserves in New York have done so well too, is like show people what good fire looks like on their own property.
That is an awesome point from your PBA director. That I can't help but think that when it goes for mowing your grass. If you have neighbors nearby, it does for me. If my neighbors down the street have all mowed their grass and I was too busy or just didn't get to it, all of a sudden I'm like, okay, it's time to mow. It's the same thing for burning. That's an
Uh,
excellent, it's like social pressure is so
mhm.
powerful for pushing us over the edge to take action, even if there's all these other reasons that we know we should do it, but social pressure is such a powerful uh, stimulator for action. So, question that we got in from Michael Robert. Michael says, could you talk about grants for private landowner help?
Yeah, 100%. Or sorry, did you want to do the certificate one or the grant one? Sorry.
Go do the grant one. The certificate
Okay,
one, we'll get the link for the CFEs. If Christian can get that in the chat, we'll do that.
sweet. Um, yes, so we as the PBA, we're a 501c3 nonprofit as well as Tall Timbers, and so we do a lot of grant writing and working for private landowners as well as working with partners like the NRCS to help landowners get help. Your local prescribed burn association, if you have one, is a great opportunity to interface with people that are knowledgeable about grants for landowner help. And honestly, I don't think I've met a natural resources practitioner that in Southwest Georgia specifically or Northwest Florida that is not here to help the landowner or keep their land and keep it well managed. I cannot stress that enough. We are here. We are the help. We are here to help. That is what we get paid to do because we want people to keep their land and to keep it well managed. Because 93% is owned by y'all. And so we could do an amazing job on 7% of the landscape and have great habitat. But if we're not helping that 93%, it could be all for naught.
Here's a fun question that came in from Ian. Ian says, "Do you have any pushback from hunters about the loss of hardwoods? And if so, how do you make the argument for the improved habitat?" Ian says, "I'm just looking for more arguments to counter their fears." LOL. Just a good, honest question right there.
That is such a good question, Ian. And I actually have an entire different presentation on that I gave at the Georgia Fire Council meeting last year. But so the like for wildlife habitat for hunters is really interesting because most of the burning I've been doing this year in the drought is actually burning for turkey habitat, where we're getting rid of a lot of the nasty scrub and promoting some of the nicer turkey woods in the bottoms. And we've seen turkey busters in them this year. We actually, like literally 2 days ago, my PBA vice president went on a site visit for his hardwoods and he flushed 15 turkeys out of his 60-acre stand that we had burned a month ago. And so they're out in there utilizing that habitat. That is a great, refugia and cover for these animals is super important. But what people forget is that the forage production is also equally as important. And with that, just having scrub, just having like nasty, thick habitat, it's a good cover, but that's it. And really, it does not need to be as dense as people think it does. And if that is truly your concern, you can burn it a lot more patchy and still get a best of both worlds scenario. But to be honest, where I have seen the most deer and turkey this year is when we've been burning our bottoms, which we did like 15, 16 bottomland burns this year in Southwest Georgia, and we have seen wildlife utilize those like crazy.
Question that we had that came in from Jeremy. Jeremy says he's not as familiar with the region that you've described. Could you talk about the primary woody species that are coming up in areas that have had a lack of fire?
See, this is a great question to answer because there's only like three. Well, sumac is four, I guess. But so generally, what I'm seeing is sweet gum, which is a native, but it kind of belongs in the bottomlands and in the kind of the ecotone shift from the bottom to the uplands. And when you have stands that have a lot of that compaction and if they lost that well drained quality, they get you get a lot more sweet gum in your uplands. And then water oak and live oak, and then a little bit of southern red oak, which fire to an extent, but generally it's that like that water oak and that sweet gum that I'm trying to manage the most with fire, and I'm usually utilizing more growing season fire to do that, which we need a lot more trees per acre to do. Except for maybe this year because it's so dry, but I've really been trying to stay out of the uplands burning this year so far.
Great question here by John. It's kind of lengthy. The gist of it, though, is that why are hardwoods looked upon as the enemy of the pine ecosystems? That's a whole nother presentation to dive into as well, isn't it?
So, John, I'm not a quail biologist, so I'm going to give you a fire practitioner's answer and not a quail biologist's answer. If you have specific quail biologist questions, there's a plethora of them at Tall Timbers that can answer this. But in my opinion, so quail are they're a shrub obligate species, right? They're not a pine obligate or a savanna obligate. So they like the scrubbiness. But the problem is that we lose the habitat that they select for, like that scrubby, waist high or so, shrubs really fast in Southwest Georgia and honestly most of the Southeast. So if we don't burn, we could burn every year and we'd still see hardwoods and we'd still see them in our stands because we're only ever really top killing them. We're basically only ever mowing them. Occasionally, we'll see mortality from them the later we burn in the year, but I'm generally doing that because there's just too many of them. And so in our native soils, there's a pretty good mix because the wiregrass and some of our other species are doing a great job with competition, but we don't do as well with competition in our more degraded old field sites. And so we have to keep them burning. We have to keep burning them and keeping them back because if we don't, they will just become gangbusters. They'll get way too tall and nothing will use them anymore, except for maybe like oven birds and a couple other species. But most of our like game bird species just won't utilize them. Even ruffed grouse and other species like that, they like young forests. They don't like stands that have a lot of mature stuff like that. I hope that makes sense.
We have a question that was in the chat from Robert, and I want to break it up into two parts here. Robert's asking about approaches or techniques for fire following hurricanes. Have you burned in hurricane impacted stands, and what have you learned about that? Again, I think that's kind of a whole nother webinar, but in a
Oh yeah.
nutshell, what are a couple of things or a few things?
Oh, okay, yes, 100%. So the thing about burning in post-hurricane debris is that it looks really scary because there's a lot of timber on the ground. But the thing we have to remember about the timber on the ground is that it's generally considered a 1,000 hour or 10,000 hour fuel. And so the best case scenario that we can do is burn it a couple days after a rain when we'll get fire to carry, hopefully slough the bark off and then not consume the relatively fresh wood in on the ground. And every time, just like your skin, just like basically anything, heat degrades things relatively or more quickly. So the more exposure you can have those 1,000 hour fuels to heat, the more quickly they're going to fall out of the system. And so what I've done personally is tried to burn some of those stands quicker to or more soon after the hurricane, where we're kind of burning it through. It may look scary because that's a lot of fuel loading on the ground, but we have to make sure that we're burning them when their fuel moistures are to the point where they're not going to consume. And if the bark catches, great. It's going to help break down the fuel quicker. The other thing is just as a basic practice, make sure you're burning off of bare mineral soil breaks for stuff like that, and treat it more like you might treat a site prep burn, where you're being extremely careful, but just really make sure that their fuels are relatively wet because again, they are 10,000 or 1,000 hour fuels. I hope that makes sense.
Good question here from Lee. Lee says wiregrass seems very vulnerable to extirpation from severe land conversion, like a cotton field. So Lee's asking, does wiregrass recover in these areas? Good question.
I tell people when it's on their property, it's a badge of honor because it means their property has likely never seen any kind of land conversion except for maybe grazing for cattle. No, it does not recover. If you harrow your fields, it's gone for what they say that it's gone for 40 years, but I think it's for all intents and purposes more or less gone for your lifetime. You can plant it with some success, but it's really finicky because it really does not like any kind of compaction at all. The general rule of thumb for most of the forestry staff that I've talked to is that it can handle a roller chopping once, and after that, never again. But I don't know that that's not scientifically backed. That's just a thing that I have heard. I would say generally, if you're harvesting timber in there, that's one thing, but if you're cultivating it, it's probably gone.
Yep. Kevin Robertson is a good one to talk to at Tall
Yes.
Timbers about the impacts of soil disturbance on wiregrass and other ground cover. I want to circle back to the same question from Robert, but I broke it up into two bits. And Robert was asking about the hurricanes and what you've learned about burning post hurricane. I wanted to see, you were talking about how much burning you guys have been doing this year. And we are in a drought that's unlike many of us have seen in a really long time across in this area and across the region. So, what have you learned from burning this season while it's been so dry?
Well, burning prescribed fire is, and I have to preference this. This is my personal, like, this is the how I have been managing my prescribed burn association with fire. And this is not reflective of how other people have done it or do it. But prescribed burning is all about resource objectives, right? We're writing objectives, we are operating in an environment to meet those objectives, and we are monitoring. So we're always burning to meet an objective. And so this year, for PBA members, that silviculture has been their largest concern. So these are landowners that are burning and trying to meet, and trying to have timber as a commodity. These are not people that are utilizing their properties necessarily for other things, like hunting or things that they need to burn. Timber is their commodity as well as personal use of the property. So what I have been doing is trying to keep out of the uplands as much as I can. I've been utilizing fire in the ecotone shift between the uplands and the bottomlands. They call it the mid slope ecotone, as well as burning the bottomlands because it's as far as I can tell, it's a 200-year drought so a lot of our trees that are not 200 years old have theoretically never seen a fire or a drought this bad. And so I've been trying to burn areas naturally burn during this time. And for the most part, I've been keeping out of the uplands. I have been burning young longleaf pine where it makes sense, where we're like a couple days pre or post rain. There's available soil moisture, and they're not candling. I have, for the most part, unless it's 1 year rough or just even some 2 year rough, been completely avoiding burning our upland pines just because I've seen Ips beetles in large numbers in Southwest Georgia, and I'm genuinely worried about being the person that's introducing the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, of a stress of these trees for people that utilize timber as a commodity on their properties. Not to say, I haven't burned upland pines, but it's a very sticky thing. Now, if you had 30 basal area and you're burning it for a different resource objective, it makes sense to do that. But for some of my landowners that have higher basal areas, they're not 1 year rough stands, they're not even 2 year rough stands. It's not necessarily my ideal time to burn those stands. I hope that makes sense. That's a
Interesting.
really long answer.
No, it's interesting. No, to think you're thinking in terms of this uh, compounding interacting disturbances, and you don't want to be the one that adds that fire disturbance on top of an already stressed upland stand. Is that
Oh
right?
yeah, 100%. I mean,
Yeah.
we've had a drought since October that we had a little bit of reprieve from, and then we're in another drought. Our KBDI is like not gone below 400 basically the whole year. So the trees are definitely stressed. I don't think that anybody would argue that. And then, I mean, we have our fuel moistures are super low. We have way more fuel loading because the average fuel moisture that I've been burning off of is sub 10%. So we're real low. our fuels. We're catching every cat face on fire. So it does not seem prudent to provoke a potential beetle outbreak to this gets into historic range of variation of fire. Like, hey, 2 year fire return interval doesn't mean every 2 years forever it burned. It just means some years it burned 1 year and some years it burned 3 years. But that's another presentation.
All right. I think our questions have slowed down. I want to see what you think about from your position working with PBAs and private landowners in Southwest Georgia. This is a two-part question. This is a David question. What does the future of prescribed fire in this region look like? Part one. And part two is what what can we all, everybody, do to help promote and sustain the use of fire in this region?
You broke up on mine for the first part of that
Okay.
question.
So the first part is what does the future of fire in Southwest Georgia look like? And part two is what can society do to help sustain that effort?
I think the future of fire in Southwest Georgia is smoke management. I think that's our number one concern. I think that generally speaking, the acceptance of fire due to the large spatial scales of our properties is pretty high. But what we're really going to have to monitor is being smart about where we're putting our smoke and why we're putting our smoke there. It's crucial that we're maintaining these ecosystems for the biodiversity that we have. I mean, we are number one or number two, depending on who you ask, for biodiversity in the world, more so than the Amazon rainforest. But we also have populations of people that we have to, make sure that we are not impacting. It is something that I preach in the PBA. Most of my burns around all of my burns around smoke sensitive areas. I run both PB Piedmont and V Smoke on and Blue Sky Playground now. So we're getting a lot of technology and a lot of batching of our saving of our data to make sure that I and my PBA, if I'm part of the burn, is doing proper smoke management. I think that the the future is going back a little bit to the culture that was here back in the day when neighbors are helping neighbors do burning. I think that's where I'm seeing the best success in the PBA is where I have like 3 or 4 landowners that are like a mini PBA that they're all helping each other burn. They're now friends. They have unified from fire. Fire is the great unifier. It brings people together of different backgrounds, and you can't have drama when you have a fire on the ground. I mean, they just do not. You will lose it. So, yeah, I think the future in fire of Southwest Georgia is going back to that neighbor helping neighbor mentality. And it's not just little properties, it's big properties too. It's just we're kind of seeing on little properties that same sort of mentality of neighbors helping neighbors.
Very cool. All right, thank you. I'm going to get the slide up here with your email address on the screen in just a minute. Appreciate everybody. It looks like we've run up a little even over. Thanks, George. Over our time today. George, as we pull up this final slide, do you have any final comments or things that you would like to share with folks?
I do have a call to action. Whether remnant soils or old field, the key management objective hasn't changed. We need smart, purposeful application of prescribed fire on these landscapes to restore them to as close as possible to what they were. Without fire, these lands will continue to degrade. If you can't do it on your own, reach out for help. Being a good steward of the land means understanding what your land needs.
Out. George, this was super fun. We really appreciate the time that you put into that presentation. Thanks to everybody with your team and John for sharing those images. I always love seeing those historical photographs and maps and things that you guys had included in there. So really appreciate the time that went into your presentation.